This is topic 2.16, Resistance and Revolts in the U.S. Today we'll be looking at both the daily, usually nonviolent ways that enslaved people resisted, as well as the more dramatic, albeit less common episodes of militant, armed uprising. And we'll chronicle some of the major slave revolts in U.S. history, including a few we've already seen, as well as some new ones. Oh, great. Here's Trey with his usual racist mythology, like the idea that enslaved people didn't resist, which is completely untrue. Trey probably believes this because, first, he doesn't understand what resistance means, and he's only thinking of armed revolt, and second, because he doesn't know the history of armed revolts and how common they actually were. So let's correct him on both counts today. First of all, there's more than one way to resist oppression, and some of the most common types of resistance were more low key than chopping off enslavers' heads. Enslaved people resisted their exploitation on a daily basis, doing whatever they could to sabotage the systems that exploited their labor. This included planned work slowdowns, breaking tools, stealing food, and running away or helping others to run away. These daily, nonviolent forms of resistance galvanized and sustained the abolition movement and proved that African Americans never consented to their enslavement. But at the other end of the spectrum, there were also instances of armed revolt, in which enslaved African Americans actually took up arms and slew their oppressors. This type of thing didn't happen every day, but it certainly wasn't as rare as slavery apologists like Trey would have us believe. The reason violent resistance didn't happen more often is that, although in a few cases it led to freedom, it usually resulted in retaliation and more restrictive laws that made life worse for the majority of enslaved people. Nonetheless, armed uprisings did occur regularly throughout the history of North America, and in the remainder of this lesson, we'll chronicle 9 of them. The first known slave uprising in what is now the United States took place while the Spanish were still exploring the region of North America they called La Florida. In 1526, they brought a group of slaves with them from Santo Domingo to explore the coast of what is now Georgia and South Carolina. Before long, a major rebellion broke out, which is believed to be the first slave rebellion on what is now U.S. soil. Many of those who participated were able to escape into unexplored territory, where they joined indigenous communities with whom they shared a common enemy in the Spanish colonizers. In 1739, another major slave rebellion broke out, this time in South Carolina, which was then a colony of the British Empire. Enemies of the Protestant British, the Catholic Spanish began offering freedom to any enslaved people who reached Spanish Florida and converted to Catholicism. This led to the Stono Rebellion, in which an enslaved Congolese soldier named Jemmy and about 100 others burned plantations and slew white enslavers before marching southward toward freedom. It was the largest slave rebellion in the history of the British colonies, and it led South Carolina to pass new laws restricting the movement of enslaved people. 42 years later, the Haitian Revolution began in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Led by Toussaint Louverture, the rebellion grew into a full-scale revolution, and in 1804 the French withdrew from Saint-Domingue, whose formerly enslaved residents created the second independent nation in the Americas, the Republic of Haiti. You may recall that the Haitian Revolution also led France to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States, doubling the size of the country overnight. In 1800, while the Haitian Revolution was still raging on, an enslaved man from Virginia named Gabriel Prosser was developing a plan to free his people. Gabriel was apprenticed to a blacksmith and had become quite skilled in the trade. His owner began renting out his services to other plantations in the area, which gave Gabriel the opportunity to speak to enslaved people across a wide area and recruit them to his cause. His plan was to storm a government arsenal where weapons are stored, and then to overthrow Virginia's government, just as the Haitians had done to the French. Unfortunately, Gabriel's plot was delayed by bad weather and exposed by treachery, as one of the co-conspirators leaked his plans to the authorities. Gabriel was eventually arrested on charges of conspiracy and attempted murder, and was hanged along with 25 others. Whites in Virginia were terrified that an attempted rebellion had almost taken place, and the state legislature passed more restrictive measures against freedom of movement for enslaved people. In 1811, the largest slave rebellion on U.S. soil took place in Louisiana. It was caused in part by the Haitian Revolution, which caused white planters to flee Hispaniola and bring their slaves with them to Mississippi, one of the only parts of North America where sugar can grow. By 1811, this land was part of the United States, and the Haitian Revolution was over, but word of the successful uprising in Haiti inspired one man, Charles Delande, to incite a rebellion of his own. He assembled a small army of up to 500 enslaved people and marched down the Mississippi River with the intention of seizing New Orleans. This is known as the Louisiana Slave Uprising. Delande and his men burned plantations as they marched downriver, but before arriving in New Orleans, they were intercepted by the Louisiana State Militia, supported by the U.S. Army and Navy. The rebellion was suppressed with extreme brutality. Delande and several others involved were executed, and their heads were cut off and mounted on pikes as a grisly warning to frighten other would-be rebels in the area. This horrific punishment is commemorated by this monument, which still stands in Louisiana today. 11 years later, another planned rebellion was in the works in South Carolina. The plan was developed by a former slave who had purchased his freedom, named Denmark Vesey. Like Charles Delande, Denmark Vesey was inspired by the success of the Haitian Revolution, but, like Gabriel Prosser, Vesey was betrayed by those who were involved. His plans were reported to the authorities, and he was hanged along with 34 others. In 1831, an enslaved preacher named Nat Turner led one of the country's most famous slave revolts. Turner led some 70 armed slaves in destroying plantations, freeing slaves, and killing enslavers throughout Richmond, Virginia. Turner's actions were vilified in American news media, adding to the white fears of slave revolts. After a few days, the rebellion was suppressed, but Turner himself escaped into the woods. About 30 days later, he was discovered, arrested, convicted, and hanged. Before the end of that decade, a major uprising took place on board a Spanish slave ship called the Amistad, which was departing the Spanish colony of Cuba when a Sierra Leone native named Sengbe Pie led a revolt that resulted in the death of the ship's captain. The Africans demanded to be returned to Sierra Leone, but the crew gradually steered them back toward North America, where they were arrested and put on trial. After 2 years, the Supreme Court ruled that they had acted legally, and they were set free and ultimately returned to Africa. It is important to note that the court's decision was based on the fact that international slave trading had been banned by the U.S. in 1808. Had the uprising taken place on U.S. soil and not at sea, they would have been found guilty of murder and executed, just as Turner, Vesey, Delande, and Prosser had been. And that brings us to our last major slave revolt, which also took place at sea. In 1841, a slave ship called the Creole was making a routine trip from Virginia to New Orleans, something it did often, transporting slaves from the upper South to the lower South as part of the domestic slave trade. However, on this particular voyage, there was an enslaved man on board by the name of Madison Washington. Washington knew that the Creole's path to New Orleans would pass right by the Bahamas, which were a British colony, and that the British had abolished slavery in 1833. Washington and others rose up and took control of the ship, piloting it to the Bahamas, where all 130 captives disembarked and became free. So there you have it, Trey. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, and often risked their lives doing so. The real question isn't whether they resisted, but whether violence was an effective strategy. This is something we'll continue to discuss as we move forward in the course, but hopefully now we can put this myth to bed. Black people resisted oppression. They always resisted. They still resist. Stay tuned.